Hello everybody, thank you for inviting me to talk today. My name is Robert Dorrell. I am a Professor of Fluid Mechanics at the University of Hull, where I also lead the AURA Centre for Doctoral Training in Offshore Wind Energy and the Environment. Now today I'm going to talk about offshore wind and its potential impacts on the physics of stratified seas. To start off with, it's really helpful to lay out the state of the sector to date. We all know that the UK has hugely ambitious plans to dramatically increase offshore wind to 50 gigawatts by 2030 and to well over 100 gigawatts by 2050. And this is set against the 14 gigawatts or so that's been installed in the past 20 years. Now, to achieve this, the UK government has set out, through the British Energy Security Strategy, ambitions to reduce consenting time of offshore wind farms from 4 years down to 1, and also to enable strategic decision making of environmental considerations. Now, growth of the sector is pushing the industry to develop deeper and deeper water locations. This is necessitating innovative and increasingly larger technologies. For example, semi-submersible foundations such as the one shown here. Deep water developments, in particular, are encroaching into seasonally stratified seas. Here, water is heated by the sun to form two distinct layers: warm surface water overlaying cold, denser, deeper water. The interface between these layers is critical to primary production and therefore underpins shelf sea ecosystems. However, existing foundations are already large enough to penetrate these stratified layers, and any flow past foundations will artificially mix the water column. Currently, we lack the models and the physical understanding to properly parameterize these mixing effects, and therefore we lack the understanding of the potential impacts of the development of offshore wind at scale. However, a range of current research at the University of Hull will start to develop the foundational evidence for the two-way physical impacts of single offshore wind foundations on stratified waters. To understand the potential impact of offshore wind infrastructure, we can use some very simplified models. Taking the well-studied Celtic Sea, for example, where tidal velocity is the order of a few tens of centimetres per second, we can estimate the additional mixing induced per area of a wind farm occupied by, say, a classical monopile foundation some 12 metres in diameter. Here, the additional mixing may be estimated as the flow power needed to overcome drag past a cylinder. Now, further, we know that natural mixing of our seas must be balanced against background energy dissipation, which we can measure. The outcome from such leading order estimates is that monopiles in this region of the Celtic Sea may increase mixing by 170% on average. However, it should be noted that mixing scales linearly with obstacle diameter, and some foundations are considerably larger than the simple monopile structures used here. Further, idealized numerical models can help us understand the differences between different types of foundations. The simulations shown here of weakly stratified low Reynolds number flow past infrastructure were conducted by Charlie Lloyd, a Leverhulme Fellow at the University of Hull. They highlight the difference between mixing behind a full water depth cylinder and a cylinder truncated at the density interface. This is analogous to fixed bottom versus floating foundations. The simulations show that different foundations have fundamentally different impacts. The full depth cylinder mixes the flow far downstream in a narrow, relatively stabilised wake, whereas flow separation forces mixing immediately downstream of the truncated cylinder, but the disturbance to the environment generates very, very low frequency internal waves which propagate in a rapidly growing wake downstream. Now, the work done so far evidences that vertical structures in stratified water, such as offshore wind foundations, will dramatically increase local mixing. This will weaken stratification and enhance nutrient flux, at least locally. However, all of this may be beneficial. Enhanced mixing could offset global warming, which would otherwise strengthen stratification. Now, we also know that foundation design influences what type and how much mixing is generated. Thus, different foundations may be optimized for different purposes in different locations, potential nature-based solutions of the future. Further, although additional evidence is required, strategic environmental impact assessments should start to consider local impacts on stratification. And from an engineering perspective, foundation and mooring design should also consider changes in hydraulic loads in stratified waters. So, in summary, the future of offshore wind is in the stratified waters surrounding the UK. But offshore wind farms will add new, additional mixing to these environments. Such infrastructure-induced mixing may have positive environmental impacts. However, we are only just beginning to understand the fundamental physics underpinning it. This means it is not yet possible to robustly incorporate such processes in shelf C models, where development of such tools are urgently required and needed to assess and optimize future deep water offshore wind farm development.
Hi everyone, I'm going to tell you about the NERC-funded eSWEETs project, which will be our first attempt at measuring the physical and biological impacts of the deployment of floating offshore wind farms. Now, as our renewable energy is expanded over the next few decades, we'll be pushing the wind turbines further out into deeper water. So you can see on the map here on the right all these pink areas projected for wind turbines over the next few years. These deeper water areas have a much different oceanographic behaviour compared to the areas, the shallow water areas that have been used for wind turbines so far. Now I'll illustrate the typical behaviour of these deep water areas using a computer simulation. So this is a simple computer model of what happens to a vertical water column in these deep water areas through 1 year. So you're looking at 1 year of simulation here. So the red line is the surface temperature, blue line is the near bed temperature. So as we move through from January here, the water column's completely mixed and cooling down. We get to spring and the sunlight starts to warm up the surface layer, which gets warmer through the summer and then starts to cool down again in autumn. And then in autumn and winter, the water column reverts to a fully mixed state. So this seasonal cycle of the mixing and stratification is fundamental to how the biology of these areas works. So the green line is showing you the growth of the phytoplankton in the surface water. And you can see here that as the stratification starts in spring, that triggers the spring bloom of the phytoplankton. As the stratification is eroded through to winter, that triggers the autumn bloom. Through the summer, not a great deal goes on in the surface water because the water has run out of nutrients. And the nutrients are trapped down in the deep water by the thermocline. But if you look at the vertical structure of the water column, which is what we're looking at in the bottom panel here, you can see the spring bloom in the surface water there, the autumn bloom again in the surface water there, and then you have this layer of phytoplankton growing inside the base of the thermocline through the summer. So this pattern of how the phytoplankton respond to the seasonal cycle of the physics is very sensitive to the mixing. It's very sensitive to the amount of turbulence which is resupplying the nutrients through the water column. So we're interested in floating offshore wind turbines because these structures are potentially large enough to inject extra mixing into the thermocline. if they produce extra mixing in the thermocline, they have the potential for bringing deep water nutrients up into that phytoplankton layer that's growing in the thermocline and potentially up into the surface water. So they could produce extra biological production by doing this. So I thought I'd try and get my model to make some predictions about what might happen. So I took that one-dimensional model that I showed you the results of earlier, and I put in a simple parameterization of a wind farm into this model. So I've told the model how big the wind farm is. I've told the model how quickly the water is gradually drifting through the wind farm. And I've told the model the depth of influence of these floating turbine structures and also the extra mixing that is generated by those structures. So what I'm going to show you next is that water column as it gradually drifts through and out of the other side of one of these floating offshore wind farms. So same sort of data here from the model, and as you can see, the water column starts to advect through the wind farm in the middle of summer, about day 180. You can see that reduction in the stratification with the reduction in the surface temperature there. And you can see that there is a response in the biology, both in the surface data, but also looking at what happens in the chlorophyll layer as well. So the model is suggesting, given the parameterization for the wind farm that I have here, that there is a response of the biological production to the extra mixing generated by the wind farm. You can see that in more detail here. So this is looking at, in the top panel, we're looking at the thermal stratification, so the difference in temperature between the surface water and the bottom water, with and without a wind farm. And you can see with the wind farm how the stratification reduces, and then as the water comes out of the other side of the wind farm, the stratification gradually re-establishes itself to the normal levels. This is, in the bottom panel, you're looking at the integrated concentration of the phytoplankton in the water column. You can see how the phytoplankton increases as the water goes through the wind farm, and that's because the extra mixing is driving nutrients up to fuel the phytoplankton growth. But then, once the water exits the wind farm, the amount of phytoplankton actually reduces compared to the case with no wind farm. And this isn't, in this instance, it's because the wind farm has deepened the thermocline, and so for this single species of phytoplankton that the model has, the light has been reduced in that chlorophyll layer, so it reduces the productivity in that chlorophyll layer. In reality, I suspect that won't happen because there are lots and lots of species of phytoplankton, and some will be better adapted to the deeper thermocline. But it gives you a sense of the sorts of things that we need to think about in our eSWEETs project. So summer 2025, we've got a major fieldwork planned. We'll be deploying gliders upstream and downstream of the wind farm to see if we can detect any of these physical and biological responses to the extra mixing. We'll be conducting detailed surveys of the biological structure, but also the turbulence as well, to see if we can measure the enhanced mixing generated by the wind farm. And so then we'll be able to look at changes in the carbon and the nutrient mixing and also the oxygen mixing caused by the wind farm, and ultimately look at a response of the growth rates, the primary production, but also changes in the phytoplankton species as the water column structure is altered. So watch this space. Hopefully a couple of years from now we should have some interesting results for you to look at. Thanks for listening.
Hello, my name's Gareth Davies, and I'm here today representing Aquaterra and Ocean Ecology to talk about a study we've been doing for the Scottish Government Marine Directorate, looking at the Benthic ecological surveying needs for marine renewables developments. The background to this study is that there's no universal approach to benthic surveying for wind, wave and tidal activities in Scottish waters, and it was felt that standardising this would help reduce uncertainty, increase compatibility, and through that enable better understanding. The overarching aim of this study, therefore, was to review the existing survey activities and to provide recommendations for how such surveys could be improved in the context of offshore and marine renewable developments in Scottish waters. This structural framework was adopted for the study, and we're going to use that as the basis for the presentation today. The first stage was therefore to establish a context for the study, and we looked at 4 areas. Firstly, the distinctiveness of Scottish waters. Secondly, the established practices around seabed surveying. Thirdly, we looked at published guidance in the rest of the UK and elsewhere around the world. And then finally looked at published grey matter and literature around benthic surveying activity. We then moved on to a scoping stage where we firstly looked at the full range of surveying tools, techniques and technologies that were available. We then looked at the scoping factors which would help determine what might be appropriate in a particular place, and then looked at a collection of the circumstances that were associated with particular projects. And that formed the scoping stage of the study. Moving on, we then sought to classify the various techniques, technologies and tools that have been identified in terms of suitability factors. The suitability factors looked at where a particular technique might be most applicable in the project cycle, the type of information that it could be generating, the conditions within which it could be deployed, and the impacts that it may have in its own right on the environment. And it also looked at the quality of data that was produced. And that suitability was then classified into 3 layers, with red indicating the lowest suitability, yellow the middle suitability, and green the highest levels of suitability. And you can see an example here for a day grab of how that classification of suitability works for a particular technology. We then applied that suitability process to over 100 different technologies. And here you can see examples of 3, which just show some of the difference in suitability patterns that occurred, with the Van Veen grab showing lots of positive green classifications and an electric pulse trawl showing much less suitability across a range of parameters. The next stage was to look at the purpose and objectives of surveying and to look at survey design and strategies. And this enabled an evaluation of why a particular survey strategy might be needed and the details of how a survey might be designed in the context of a particular project and a particular place. So this started to set out how the techniques and technologies that we'd identified in the previous task could be applied in a survey situation. Taking into account the tools available in the context for the surveys, we then moved into a task where we were looking to recommend certain approaches that might be applicable. And the basis for this was looking at the intensity of survey activity that would be appropriate for certain circumstances. That intensity was classified in terms of ecological sensitivity and project complexity. And we developed a relatively simple scheme for classifying any particular project context in light of its sensitivity and its complexity. And based upon those 2 factors, we then established a framework which allowed us to move from what might be called a standard approach in lower sensitivity and lower complexity areas to a more enhanced approach, and then to a more comprehensive approach ultimately in the more complex and higher sensitivity areas. So we end up with 3 intensities of survey activity. What we then did is linked the level of community and habitat description to those levels of survey intensity. And as a metric for that, we've used the UNIS habitat classification scheme and essentially shown that at the standard level, it's sufficient to get to a level 4 description of community and habitat type. But in the enhanced and more comprehensive schemes, it's necessary to move to a level 5 or level 6 description. And so this provided an overall framework into which the different surveying tools and techniques could be fed to indicate what might be appropriate given particular local conditions. We then move on to consider our final conclusions arising from the study. What is apparent is that out of the wide and growing level of benthic surveying activity associated with MREDs, there's a clear set of best case approaches that can be applied to characterising seabed ecology and the issues associated with it. These can be enhanced through methods such as eDNA, but they provide a really good basis for what we need at the present time. There's also the potential to look at other issues that are emerging as possible concerns, but there are perhaps other ways that these concerns can be addressed before actually mobilising surveys to address them. Possible follow-on work could look at what should be done in addition to this study's analysis of what could be done. But overall, the information that's coming out of these surveys is going to be compelling for stakeholder engagement, and it should help provide confidence for MRED's licensing processes in the future. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at the symposium. I'm Kieran, based at SURC, and I'll talk about the nature enhancement at marine offshore energy sites, or NEMOES project. This is funded through the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund. The project only started towards the end of 2023, so I sadly don't have any results or realised impacts to share. However, hopefully I'll be able to provide a taste of what we intend to do. The project is investigating the potential ecosystem effects of the addition of subsurface structures at offshore wind farm sites. So one of the ways in which these turbines that are pictured here affect this. This is the marine ecosystem of the west of Scotland, illustrated in a food web model. This is a modelling-based project, so I'd like to start by giving a brief overview of the modelling software that is being utilised. I've realised that my big head at the bottom right of the screen gets in the way of some of the slides further on, so I'm going to disappear from the next slide onwards, but then hopefully reappear at the end if that's okay. The EcoPath with EcoSim modelling suite is one of the most widely used software internationally for modelling studies of marine ecosystems. It can be divided into three main components. EcoPath is a mass balance model where total productivity is equal to total mortality. It describes who eats who and how much. It contains additional parameters such as catches and fishing fleet structure. EcoSim is the dynamic modelling component where different drivers force change to the ecosystem through time. This could be change in fishing pressure or temperature, for example. Typically, models are fitted to observe data to validate model predictions. Ecospace is where the model is realised spatially. This can be used to look at the effects of marine protected areas or the effects of the development of offshore energy, for example. In NEMOES, we are initially investigating the west of Scotland marine environment. EcoPath with EcoSim has been extensively used in studies of this area, providing a good baseline from which we can work from. Natalia Serpetti, who is involved in this project, has previously worked on developing a high-resolution nested model for the west of Scotland. This focused on an area around the Isle of Muck and contained highly resolved data on benthic habitats. It was nested within the larger West of Scotland model, which has been fitted to observe data. Scottish Power Renewables have an option agreement through Scotland to develop an offshore wind farm to the northwest of Islay, and they expect to use fixed foundations for their turbines at this site. We are working towards redeveloping the West of Scotland model to build a nested model for this area and make predictions on the ecosystem effects of the addition of subsurface structures on the ecosystem. We are also aiming to develop a new nested model for a North Sea site. However, that's further down the line, and for now I'll focus on the West of Scotland model. The West of Scotland model contains 43 functional groups. These describe either specific species or a group of ecologically similar species, where there is typically a lack of data to separate them out. It has been fitted to observe data for the period from 1984 to 2013, and work is currently ongoing to fit the model to the present day. Direct impacts from the addition of subsurface structures as a habitat can be expected for benthic species, which are mostly circled here in the model. However, there will likely be feedback effects throughout the food web. We're also working to describe native oysters explicitly in the model. Work is currently focused on the creation of new habitat maps. The Mapping European Seabed Habitats project is providing the data we need at a high enough resolution. This is a benthic habitat map to the northwest of Islay. I couldn't fit the huge legend into the slide, sadly. It shows a mix of different sediment types and some rocky substrate, although it is mostly dominated by sand, which is coloured in red. Offshore energy sites have been identified as potentially being used as seeding grounds for native oyster beds. The presence of this species in UK waters has dropped significantly in the last century or so, and conservation measures are required. Oyster beds also provide a heterogeneous habitat that is utilised by many species, and we're exploring the inclusion of a distinct habitat type for this that is created alongside the subsurface structures in the model. Habitat preferences for the modelled biota will be altered to include these new habitat types. These are just some examples from the existing model. I'm going to briefly go through the planned work and expected outcomes for NEMOES. We will be comparing model output with and without the new subsurface structure habitat for the West of Scotland Macar Bay site and North Sea site. We'll investigate any predicted biomass gains for the model biota using this habitat and feedbacks through the food web. This is a stepping stone towards utilising ecosystem models such as EcoPath with EcoSim in assessing ecosystem effects of offshore wind farm developments in UK waters. Prior studies have considered some other effects, although there is a need to move towards multi-effect models where any potential negative and positive effects are included to consider the net impacts. Thank you for listening. I want to say thank you to the project team and to our advisory group, which includes our chair, Flora, amongst many other fantastic people. And a thank you to the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund for funding this work.